everyone. Welcome to your newest Cosmic Matrix podcast episode. And on this podcast, we are going to discuss the inner marriage, healing the feminine and masculine within. So today, we're going to dive into the profound and often hidden dance between the feminine and masculine energies within each of us. This sacred inner union lies at the heart of Jung's concept of individuation, which is the journey of becoming a whole human being. And we become whole not by rejecting our opposites, not by pretending to be perfect, but by consciously integrating those opposites. And so in this two-part podcast, we will explore one of the most potent and often unconscious forces that shape our inner world and our relationships, what Jung called the anima and animus. These archetypal figures represent the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women, and they form the invisible architecture between our attractions, our conflicts, and our projections. So in part one, we'll explore what the anima and animus truly are, how they're shaped by early experiences, especially with the opposite sex parent, how they show up in romantic relationships, the difference between integrating the anima and animus and being possessed by them, and how unconscious dynamics like idealization, emotional fusion, our judgments, and our power struggles play out, guided by the anima animus, even when we're not aware of them. And in part two, we're going to turn inward and we're going to look at what it actually means to heal and integrate these inner figures. We're going to talk about the 4 developmental stages of both the anima and animus, how their wounds can surface in dating, intimacy, and our emotional life, and how to recognize when they're unconsciously influencing your choices. And ultimately, we're going to close with exploring the path towards sacred inner union, what Jung called hieros gamos, where the inner masculine and feminine meet in conscious and harmonious relationships. So whether you're navigating reoccurring relationship patterns, you're dealing with self-critical thoughts, or you feel emotionally off-center lately, this podcast will offer you a profound framework rooted in depth psychology that can bring deeper understanding and meaningful change to your relationships. So for those who are new to our podcast, we always have a second hour where you can join and listen to every second hour of over 150 podcasts now. So go to veilofreality.com/membership and you can listen to the second hour. And I also have a quick announcement. I am going to be starting writing longer articles on Substack starting next week. So if you would like to join our community, or my community rather, on Substack, please go to lauramatsu.substack.com and you have a link to subscribe and you'll have my longer writing sent to your email. So I hope to see some of you there. Okay. So we got to begin with some basic definitions of what are the anima and animus. So to define them, the anima is the inner feminine image in men. You could also think as the feminine soul in men. And the animus is the inner masculine image in women. You can think of this as the masculine spirit in women. That's a definition that I'm paraphrasing. That's from Barbara Hanna's amazing book on the animus, which I can highly recommend for women if you want to go deeper into this. Basically, these are archetypal figures that live in the unconscious that act as bridges to the collective unconscious. And to quote Emma Jung, they belong not only to the individual consciousness, so we each have our own individual flavor of anima and animus, but they also belong to the collective unconscious, and they form a connecting link between the conscious and the unconscious. So some characteristics of the anima would be emotional depth, receptivity and fantasy, soulfulness and mystery. And some characteristics of the animus are logic, opinion, willpower, direction, discernment, and inner authority. So again, men have an anima, women have an animus. And to give you some examples of how they might show up, one thing to look for is your dreams, actually. So or even in fairy tales or movies as well, we often see anima and animus being played by certain characters. But when it appears in these myths or dreams, it will show up as a muse, a lover, sometimes a witch, sometimes a nurturing figure, depending on how the anima is constellated. And the animus may emerge in dreams or myths as an inner critic, a preacher, a voice of judgment, a figure of authority. And these figures often show up to balance what's underdeveloped in our conscious identity. So they show up as a compensation. So if we are a really passive and nurturing and loving woman externally, we can actually grow a compensatory animus figure who will be the opposite of that. So that's the most important. We've talked about this and holding the tension between opposites, another podcast episode, but to understand this compensatory role is very important.
Great. So that was a good basic introduction of the anima-animus dynamics as we dive deep into all of that. And so we want to first look at how they are actually formed. And both the anima and animus are shaped very early in life, most often through the relationship with the opposite sex parent, but also through the collective myths, archetypal figures we unconsciously absorb in general about men and women, even what we see socially or culturally, the zeitgeist of our views of men and women in general. And here another quote by Emma Jung: "The character of these figures, anima and animus, is conditioned by the experience each person has had and also by the collective image." So it's a personal and a collective manifestation of these images. Now, let's look first at how the anima for men is formed. And there can be different manifestations or qualities of the anima, rather, based on the relationship you as a man had to your mother. Now, that could be the distant or emotionally absent mother. Many boys growing up with that were dealing with that. And then you as a man may seek women who are emotionally unavailable or mysterious or out of reach, mirroring the longing he felt as a child. And then his anima becomes associated with a certain yearning, fantasy, and unfulfilled desire. Very interesting, because I can also relate to that, even astrologically. That shows also up in my birth chart. You always seek that, what you were basically given or not given within your own upbringing on a basic foundation. And then there is the overprotective or smothering mother. Then he may unconsciously attract emotionally overwhelming or dependent women as a man, if you had a very overprotective mother. Or his anima takes on a devouring or engulfing tone. He fears losing his autonomy, right? You can lose yourself in a relationship. You can become very codependent in a sense. And then the third one is the idealized or self-sacrificing mother, right? If you had a woman you basically also put on a pedestal, so to speak. Then you project perfection onto women, your anima, project on other women as an image of perfection, expecting unconditional love, but you will grow resentful when they show human flaws, that they're just human and they will never ever be able to live up to this idealized image you have. And then the anima becomes more angelic or saintly, setting up very impossible expectations in love. Now, I would also say that these they are not so clearly distinct. They can also overlap, because I can see myself in all of them.
Yeah, these were just some common examples. Exactly. These are not all of them. The main important thing is to look at how you perceived your mom, basically. So you could write, my mom is like, and then just stream of consciousness, write the adjectives. Mm-hmm. That will give you a good idea of actually how your early parental figure constellated the anima. So it's going to have a particular tone for each individual. These are just the common examples. Yeah. Okay, so how the animus is formed in women, some common examples. The first, if you had a critical or authoritarian father, you may internalize a harsh inner voice that constantly judges you or others. Very, very common form of animus possession, by the way. The animus most commonly shows up in women in severe judgments. So this tyrannical authoritarian father then becomes the way that your animus is within you. And then you either become that way towards yourself or you become that way towards men in your life. And so your animus will become a more punishing force. It will push you towards perfectionism or distrust in men. Another really common example is the absent or emotionally unavailable father. In this case, you may long for strong male figures. You may project your animus onto spiritual teachers, bosses, partners. Your animus gets projected outward, where you seek salvation through men's strength or direction without gaining that strength within yourself. So you become dependent on these strong male figures and you project your animus externally. Another common pattern is an idealized or charismatic father. In this case, you may be drawn to powerful men or men that have a certain magnetism to them, but end up disappointed or feeling controlled by them. So your animus then becomes fused with charisma, which could also blind you to red flags or manipulation, because I'm sure many of you know who understand psychology that just people who are charismatic don't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good partner for you or a good person.
Well, hardcore narcissists or even sociopaths and psychopaths can have a strong mask, charismatic mask.
Exactly. So we need to emphasize these early patterns become the blueprint for what we find attractive, repulsive, or even divine in others. And these early patterns also determine how we relate to power, truth, love, and our own soul, because the anima and animus are not just about romance, they're about our own inner orientation to life. So it's our own inner orientation to life, but we also tend to project these images outwards, which is why, which we'll talk about way later in the podcast, we will meet these images again and again in our relationships.
Excellent. So now let's look at how the anima and animus shows up specifically in romantic relationships. So we start with the anima in man and the search for the soulful other. And it's a big one, because all these anima projections of man towards women in various forms has also become very much socially accepted without understanding the projective qualities behind them. So the anima within the man basically acts as his unconscious connection to emotions, intuition, vulnerability, and soul, the feminine qualities. But if they're not integrated, she often then appears in projection, meaning we project as men our disconnected, unintegrated anima qualities onto women, who we then fall in love with, right? That's kind of the first stage, what a lot of people also call romantic love. And then the man believes basically that this woman will complete him, awaken him, or even save him from his own disconnection, right? We literally project our anima soul qualities on the women to carry, to bear.
Can I give an example of this? Because
Yes.
I've experienced this multiple times. So like, for example, a guy can completely exile himself from the anima by living in the head. So severely intellectual men who are cut off from feelings will meet a woman who is very emotional, intuitive, and then he will completely depend on her to awaken him or to save him from his own inner disconnection. This is a very common pattern that you see. So hyper intellectual, rational men then expect these intuitive, emotional women to live their soul life to them. But then it can easily go wrong, as we're about to share.
He may also project that on them, which they don't necessarily have either.
Yes,
because that
for
was
sure.
in my case.
For sure, yeah.
Which, because you may feel enchanted by her mystery or emotional depth, like you mentioned, but project a certain mystery over her. Which you may be convinced that she's the one, right? The one who understands or redeems you completely. But you will be crushed when she turns out again to be just a human, flawed, real, or different than your fantasy. And that's when most people break up, right? Because they think they're fallen out of love. No, you fell in love as a man with the projected image of your own inner anima overlaid onto the woman, which she was never able to live up anyway. We can even show on a more collective level the more collective anima projections of man. One of the first one was towards Marilyn Monroe.
Yes.
Right? There's a huge anima projection.
Yeah,
right?
this goes into the category of what they call like an anima or anima woman who then holds this collective projection. Right. But that's a story for another day.
Exactly. So when the projection collapses, because the woman you as man project on will never be able to live up to the projected anima image, you will then fall into a moodiness, resentment, or deep disappointment. We talked about moodiness. We had a podcast about healing the masculine one, ties into the Holy Grail myths and King Arthur and all of that. And when a man is in a mood, he basically becomes actually then possessed by his own inner anima. And you're kind of disconnected also from your healthy masculinity. You become withdrawn emotionally, or you're shut down altogether. And you can spiral into depression, haunted by the feeling something is missing, there's nothing out there for anyone for me anymore, because you have given away your power via the act of projection. And to quote Emma Jung, within the soul of such a man, the negative mother anima will endlessly repeat, and it will say to itself, I'm nothing, nothing makes sense. So you become very moody, very just wallowing in self-pity and just very lifeless.
Or he can be completely shut down emotionally.
Shut down, that's the other extreme.
Yes, it's either he shuts down emotionally or becomes overly emotional. It's either
hyper-intellectualizing it.
Exactly, or just completely cut off.
And there's certain patterns that then emerge, right? So when the man does not have an integrated anima, but projects it onto other women, there's always a serial infatuation, continuously falling in love too quickly, just because you see somebody, maybe even on social media or in person or the waitress or whoever it may be, right? You just fall in love, quote unquote, too quickly. And that's a big sign of anima projection, especially for a man in this case. There's a certain romantic idealism followed by ghosting or emotional withdrawal. And there's also the addiction to the honeymoon phase or sexual fantasy, mistaking sexual infatuation for love and all of that, and the romanticism and all of that. This is all anima projection. But when the anima is developed, right, which means the man has more conscious connection to his own soul qualities, to his own inner feminine, the anima, more integrated, then the man becomes more emotionally attuned but also grounded, right? So it's not being emotionally overwhelmed, and definitely not emotionally disconnected, but grounded. The man is creatively inspired because he embodies the inner muse, right? He doesn't need an external feminine figure or something out there to depend himself on or project his creativity on, right? A lot of men who are also disconnected from the inner feminine, they're naturally gravitating to very creative women, mistaking that as the inspiration. So you become more creatively inspired when the anima is integrated. And the man is more capable of deep relating without fantasy or fusing with others. Meaning without needing to merge or just losing yourself basically in the relationship. And ultimately the man will be more in touch with his intuitive qualities and also the symbolic dimensions of life, meaning really embodying the feminine qualities within himself in a very healthy, grounded way.
Okay, so let's discuss the animus in woman, which is really the inner voice, which can either judge you or others or guide you. So the animus in a woman connects her to logic, discernment, boundaries, her voice, and her spiritual convictions. But if it's not integrated, it often manifests again through projection. So you will think towards men in your life, he must be the teacher, the savior, the powerful man who knows what I don't. And you may unconsciously look to male figures for validation, for purpose, for direction, idealize men with strong opinions or authority, but then feel betrayed when they disappoint you. You can also expect a man to fix her or offer you certainty and then react harshly when he reveals uncertainty or his own vulnerability. And to quote Emma Jung, the animus expresses itself chiefly in two ways: a critical, usually a negative comment, and issuing commands or prohibitions, like you should, you shouldn't, I should, I shouldn't. It can take on a super egoic tone. And patterns that may emerge: chronic dissatisfaction in relationships, he's not enough, criticizing your partner, very common way, criticizing yourself can be a dual dance of that. I know this very intimately. Your inner dialogue will be full of judgments, criticisms, or self-doubt. You will also attract controlling or emotionally unavailable men. And then you could also push away emotionally available men, thinking of them as too soft or not masculine enough. And in the woman, when the animus is developed, she can speak her truth clearly and calmly without being tyrannical and authoritarian, by the way. You can set boundaries from a place of inner authority, not reaction. You also don't overdo the boundaries, which closes you off from others. You also honor your feminine while holding a sense of inner structure and internal sense of direction. And you'll embody discernment without losing empathy. And as well, the thing that the anima and animus share in common with men and women when they're highly developed is that then they become a link, they become a messenger of your creative life. They become a source of creative inspiration within you when the animus is integrated and not projected.
It's interesting as you were sharing about the animus projection of women towards men in different ways. It kind of reflects back the hype around trad wife relationships.
Yes.
The submissive woman wants a leading man, or the polarity, which has some aspects. I don't want to throw the babe with the bathwater, but do you see the danger distortions if the woman, for example, doesn't have an integrated animus? Because like you said, she may then look for male figures for validation, purpose, or direction.
Yes.
Or idealize men with strong opinion of authority, right? Oh, I'm submissive, you need to lead me, which can be purely based on animus projection.
Totally, yeah. And it's also completely externalized. Like, as long as you're expecting someone outside of you to live out your soul life for you, you will be disappointed. And this is where the projections fall and you start to... So for example, let's say that you meet someone who you think is a strong masculine leader, right? And then either one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to see him become emotional and you're going to become disgusted because you just see him as a strong masculine leader. Or another thing can happen is that this guy is actually completely cut off from his anima and expects you to live that life from it. And when you want to emotionally relate to this man, he's completely unavailable. So it's gonna happen in one or two ways. And one thing that we're going to talk about, especially how anima and animus shows up in relationships, is that when the man gets possessed by his anima, so either he becomes cut off from his emotion or overwhelmed by his emotions, it will automatically trigger the animus in the woman. So she'll become critical, judgmental towards herself or towards him, and then they get into the shadow dance. And it's very interesting, as someone who's obviously working with this material and been in a relationship with someone who understands these concepts. I can see it happen with me and Bernhard again and again and again. So like, for example, if he gets into a mood, my thing is to actually be nurturing and validating without also like enabling it, and also not criticizing it, because that would be my own animus possession. So basically, if a guy gets into a mood and a woman becomes animus possessed, she might be apt to just criticize him and be like, oh, why aren't you being strong? Or, this image that I had of you. And I have to say, it can be really painful to let these projections fall. But that's the only place where true love can begin, when you begin to fall in love with the actual human being and not the projected image that you had of that person.
Just to clarify, when we use the term mood, this is a specific term by Carl Jung related to anima possession in men. And it doesn't mean just in a bad mood. There's a certain flavor of self-loathing, a certain disconnect from a masculinity. It's nothing what women experience, it's specifically in men. And I'm sure every man can relate it to some level when you're anima possessed. But if you also completely reject the anima, not animus, then you just completely cold, living in your head, and you're not capable of emotional depth. Okay, so speaking of that, let's look into relationship dynamics and when these archetypes collide, basically, within a relationship. And most often these inner figures meet each other before we actually truly meet the other person. Like as Laura just mentioned, we actually there's unconscious animus projections in a relationship and battling out without really seeing each other as we clearly are.
Yeah.
Right?
Once you see this happen in your relationships, you can't unsee it.
Yes. Because what looks like love is most often, especially at the beginning, pure projection. Our souls attempt to find ourselves in another, right? So let's look at some of the common dynamics. Anima versus animus conflict. He, the man with the anima, leads with feeling and fantasy. She leads with judgment or ideology. So this is an example for a man who's anima possessed versus a woman who's animus possessed, right? Not integrated, but possessed. So emotional vulnerability basically means intellectual resistance.
Meets intellectual
resistance, exactly. And then connection becomes actually a conflict, right? Because it doesn't, it's almost a polar opposite in that sense. And then there's idealization and disillusionment. The man who projects her anima onto the woman sees her as a goddess or muse. She sees, and she who projects her animus on him, sees him as a wise man or savior, right? But when they show their humanity, the fantasy shatters. Then love turns into blame, withdrawal, resentment, power struggles, all of that.
And by the way, I want to add, this can also go on this endless cycle of processing, actually. You could just be endlessly processing stuff and never actually getting at the point of the anima-animus battle underneath, which is a little bit of the shadow side of like the conscious community to like, because you can just process the issue over and over, and he could be possessed by his anima, which is just emotionally overwhelmed, and she could be possessed by her animus, which is like, let's do all the nonviolent communication, not realizing it's really the anima and animus who are battling each other out.
Or if we just mentioned, if you're just really trapped in this very superficial polarity thing, right, about being a masculine man and a feminine woman.
Yes.
You're just battling out, you're just arguing for each other's projections ad infinitum, and nobody will be able to fully embody it. It will not go in anywhere and will just destroy the relationship in the long run anyway.
Yeah, because the relationship is built on the unconscious expectation for someone to live as the outer, to almost harden into the outer persona that matches your projections.
Exactly. So what this basically results in are projection loops. That's why it's so important to really understand anima-animus dynamics in relationships, because the woman then critiques the man for not living up to her inner ideal, right? And the man collapses usually emotionally or pulls away by dissociating and escaping into his intellect and then confirming her belief, right? And round it goes until someone becomes conscious and really integrates the inner opposite within themselves. So in relationships, we're not just reacting to the other, we are actually reacting to our own unconscious figures projected on the other outwardly. Key point to understand. That's really where the rubber hits the road with self-work and self-knowledge, how your own unconscious projections are overlaid onto the image of the other person.
And to add on to that, through what's called projective identification, we can actually project these images onto the partner, and then they can become exactly the projection.
That's the irony. Yeah, exactly. So we need to recognize that anima and anima is in action, right? We're not relating soul to soul. We're in a dance of shadow and unmet needs. And they're all shaped, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, from our relationship to our opposite sex parent, and collectively culture, socially, and archetypal images of men and women. So here's some reflections to reflect on, basically, some questions to reflect on. Are you expecting your partner to carry your inner lover, parent, or guide? Right? Be very honest with yourself as you reflect. What qualities in your partner most activate you? And could they be reflections of a disowned inner figure, as we just described? Okay. So always, the moment you have like, you should be like this and why you're not like that, self-reflect on how this could be on anima or animus projections, respectively, if you're a man or a woman.
Okay, so let's dive deeper into some common pairings and conflict patterns that can happen in relationships. So when the anima and animus are not integrated, they often dominate the personality and they lead to distorted expressions of masculine or feminine energy in relationship dynamics. So let's talk about the animus-possessed woman. And again, like once you see this, you won't be able to unsee it, and you'll see all sorts of people in the world that you will see represent these. And that's valuable, actually.
In the public, too.
It will give you an idea of the template, but it's more interesting to actually use what you see externally to look within. But you will see it everywhere. Okay, the animus possessed woman. She may present as sharp, intellectually dominant, and emotionally withdrawn. Conversation with her will feel like a debate or a test. She will speak to win, not to relate. So her tone may be cold, cutting, or overly analytical. Notice how a lot of this has to do with completely being dominated by a tyrannical masculine figure and not bringing any of the feminine relatedness to her life. Vulnerability to an animus-possessed woman may be viewed as a weakness, and control becomes her default strategy. She may unconsciously, or sometimes even consciously, I've seen, especially with these gender wars we have going on, emasculate men, dismiss their emotions, or assume superiority, especially in spiritual or intellectual domains. So you see this again and again. Men should be like this. Why aren't men doing this? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, ad infinitum. Deep down, though, this is often a defense against early wounds with the father, which then can create a distrust of masculine energy. And so a woman like this honestly doesn't need a partner. She needs an inner reconciliation. Her animus isn't integrated. It's actually controlling her, which is one thing that Jung really said, is that the animus is a superior function, meaning the masculine energy can easily possess a feminine soul, basically. So it really takes over. It possesses her. She becomes judgmental. She wants to debate or test men. She emasculates them. She speaks down on them. She speaks disparagingly about men in general and makes generalizations about men, which are largely negative. And again, since we have a lot of this going on between the, far right movement, who actually tend to have a lot of animus issues and anima projections towards women, then you have the left movement who talk about toxic masculinity and, the issues with men. So we have this kind of collective shadow dance going on of animus projection that becomes normalized and externalized through the world stage. And I just want to emphasize that, because it's easy to fall in these projections if you go along with the crowd. So what you're going to do when you withdraw your projections is you're actually going to go against the curve of the collective, which wants you to externalize and project your animus onto the other. And you're going to start looking within, and you won't find a lot of people who will be doing this. I want to emphasize this. It's much easier. Like if I make a post on social media, for example, about how terrible men are and what they need to do, I can gain a lot of attention, and attraction for it from similar things. But if I point people looking within, less people will be interested in that.
I mean, that's the case of social media, be it on notice on post on Facebook or Twitter, X, whatever. If you have a more polarized towards the other, it attracts more people who have the same shadow projections.
Yes.
So it results in a whole shadow projection feast, so to speak, which also feeds occult forces, by the way. But it feels very good to the ego, the exteriorization and projection on that level. Right?
Yeah. So just to emphasize, we see this in the world. Not do we have a collective shadow dance going on, but we have collective anima and animus projection and possession, which has become the norm because the left and the right and the feminine and the masculine have become more polarized. And in Jung's view, this is actually an amazing opportunity for alchemical integration if we withdraw the projections and look at what it's teaching us.
Yeah. So let's look into the anima-possessed man. How that if he's not only disconnected but possessed by his inner anima, the feminine, he becomes overly ruled by emotion, fantasy, and longing, yet lacks the direction and solidity, right? On the other side of the coin, we talk about this later, the anima men who reject the anima completely are completely emotionless and lost in the intellect.
Yeah,
so that's
they basically
extreme, right?
cut off everything below the neck and they live in the head.
Yeah.
And I would argue that makes it harder to integrate because they've almost exiled the
That's
anima.
true. Yeah.
So you either get taken over or you exile her. And I've noticed from direct experience when men exile her, the journey can be much harder.
And they have an extreme negative image because it's exiled towards the other women outside themselves.
Yeah, and they'll become extremely unempathic, hyper-intellectual, hyper-rationalize things. They might not even believe in any ideas like soul or spirit. A whole other rabbit hole to go
get down to religious dogma and all of that.
Yes.
So, but let's go more into the anima-possessed man. And he will appear very moody, as I just talked about, very overly sensitive or passive in decision-making. And he romanticizes the feminine, right? But also resents her when she doesn't meet his soulful expectations, a little self-pity, right? He may idolize one woman after another, always seeking the one while actually never truly committing. So he always, quote-unquote, falls in love, projects his own anima onto the other, as I mentioned before, even in fleeting encounters with the waitress or with a celebrity. A lot of porn addiction can also relate to this, or the classical falling in love with the stripper and all of that. He also struggles to hold emotional boundaries and absorbs his partner's energy and becomes lost in it. So very much, too much merging and losing himself within the relationship or within the partner's energy, basically. This often stems from a fusion with the mother archetype. This is also another, I talked about this in a recent podcast about the masculine wound and the mother complex and how this affects a man as well. And also an absence of a strong, grounded masculine model, basically the missing father figure. So the anima-possessed man is not relating to the real woman in front of him. He's actually searching for his lost soul through her and projects his anima qualities onto her. That's really what it comes down to. And then again, if she doesn't live up to it, then he feels resentful and, can also develop a very anti-woman image towards all women.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens when these two meet, when they collide. Again, when a man or a woman gets anima or animus possessed, it will almost automatically and quite fascinatingly trigger the possession in the other. And then you'll just see the shadow dance go on. So she might lead with logic, control. This might on a common, like on a basic level, show up in her being very opinionated, rigid, you should, you shouldn't, be very fixed in her convictions, like no room for flexibility in her view. And then the man will either lead with emotion or longing, or he'll just dissociate emotionally. So she'll be like, so for example, the woman, if she becomes highly critical towards the man, animus possession, he might either become moody in response, anima possessed, or he'll just completely cut off and he'll escape into intellectualization, escape into the head in some way.
Rationalization.
Yeah, so she critiques, he will collapse. He seeks intimacy, she will intellectualize. She expects him to lead, he expects her to feel him deeply and guide him emotionally. So this just creates a loop of mutual disappointment where neither feels seen or met, and they're expecting the other person to live out their soul life for them. Some other common patterns you can see is an idealizer and then the rebel pattern. So one person worships the other's potential, the other rebels against the pressure to fulfill the fantasy. Or parent-child dynamics. So one becomes overly responsible and guiding, which can be often an animus-driven woman. And then the other regresses into emotional dependency, anima-driven. So if you're a woman who feels like, I got to get this guy to get his shit together or do his inner work, would be the thing that women in our circles would say. And then the other guy would just regress into depending on her emotionally or become overwhelmed emotionally. This is a parent-child dynamic. Or mutual projection. Both partners are actually relating to each other as symbols, not people, and they're unable to differentiate the real person from the projection. And this is so common, actually. It's culturally supported. It's a very common archetype. We live in a society which I would argue is like 80% externalizing things. So it's pretty normal, and you'll see it, and you'll even see it in your parents too. You know, there's a very common dynamic to have an animus possessed woman and anima possessed man, and then us to repeat those parental dynamics in our own relationships.
And Carl Jung actually gave a warning, so to speak, what will happen if you really don't understand anima, animus within men and women respectively, or within yourself. Because anima and animus, as he says, can on occasion produce tragic results. They are the father and mother of all the disastrous entanglements of fate. Because these figures, when unconscious, they can lead to affairs, justified affairs, infidelity, or emotional affairs, right? Especially nowadays with social media, that's kind of common. Or fantasies of rescue. There can be emotional shutdown or blame cycles, usual power struggles in the way Laura just described it, and deep relational dissatisfaction even in otherwise aligned partnerships where you have some common interest, right? Or you're like-minded, but there's depth missing.
Or they can, you can just be so caught up with who they should be that you're unable to actually love them as a person that they are. So, when the projections fall, you actually have the opportunity to really see who the real partner is in front of you and love that person for who they really are rather than who you imagine them to be. So sometimes the dissatisfaction in relationships is not because anything is wrong, but because you're trying to fix them into a projection. And that's super common.
That's why I like to point out again with this warning by Carl Jung, nowadays specifically, right? Especially with the rise of what happened with feminism, and then because of the rise of feminism, you have the rise of the manosphere, right, which are all based on each other's anima-animus projections, basically. And within that, you had recently the rise of the so-called polarity movement, to be a manly man, be a leading man, like I mentioned before, and the woman needs to be more submissive, and all of that, or the trad movement, right, the traditional wife, and the man is a provider. With these very superficial exterior behaviors can be disastrous, because most of them are literally based on anima and animus projection or rejection, and can become it become not only just dangerous, but a lot of suffering. And I've seen a lot of people, they get prematurely into these concepts without really understanding their own psyche, their own anima and animus. So if you really want to have a good relationship, not only with yourself, but with the opposite sex, this depth psychology of anima animus integration is key knowledge and the foundation for any successful relationship in the future, I would say.
Yeah.
So, here's a reflection to give you guys. The problem isn't always the person in front of us. Often it's the inner figure within us, actually, which we haven't yet brought into a conscious relationship. So until we do inner work with these figures, we'll keep finding partners who trigger these very archetypes again and again, until we turn inwards and gain a relationship with the anima and animus within ourselves instead of projecting it outwards.
Okay, so here's some prompts for you to dialogue with the animus. So this is mainly for women. And the first thing I'm going to say about this, and this is really the key, is that you need to disidentify with blending with your animus and thinking that's who you are. So, for example, if I have, my animus is very judgmental and very critical, because that's the way, actually it's more critical, but that's the way that my father was, right? So when that judgmental or critical voice comes up, I'm like, there's my animus again. And I start to be like, have some curiosity. So like using an internal family systems model, like curiosity is really the gateway to dialoguing with these parts without blending with them, without identifying with them, without thinking that who they are. So there needs to be a conscious disidentification with them through acknowledging, oh, there's my critical animus possession. Or like, even if I start to externalize, if I start to criticize Bernhard, right? Oh, I'm getting a little bit animus possessed. Like, what's going on there? Create some distance, create some disidentification. That's the key thing to all of this. And if you can do that and hold that witness and observer to these parts, you're already learning to integrate it without blending, without becoming possessed by it. So that's the bottom line. So some questions you can ask yourself: what does the voice of my own inner masculine sound like? Is it supportive and discerning, or is it critical and harsh? So that's one thing you can reflect on. When you need to make a decision, do you trust your inner direction, or do you defer to others? So like, do you get another astrology reading? Do you ask for validation? Like, it's fine to get feedback, but sometimes that can create an endless loop of like looking for feedback from a bunch of other people. And then you're just like, you don't even know what to do because you've gotten a million different opinions. Do I express my truth calmly and clearly, or do I silence myself? Do I attack, or do I over-explain? Very, very common way to see how integrated the animus is. Do I seek validation or protection from strong men, or do I distrust and resist them? And then here's
by the way, do I seek validation or protection from strong men? There's animus projection.
What's that?
The question you just asked, do I seek validation?
Exactly.
That's animus projection.
That's
and do
projection.
I distrust and resist them?
Rejection.
That's rejection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
It's always an overcompensation, right? So you either overdo it or underdo it. Whenever you're looking at a complex, you either overemphasize it or you underemphasize it. It's not a balanced relationship. And then here's the mother of all questions. What kind of men am I consistently attracted to? And what inner masculine qualities might they be reflecting? I'm just laughing because this is really like the question that gets asked again and again, I think. And it's the hardest one to acknowledge and the hardest pill to swallow. But the reason why is because it has the most growth potential in it.
What inner masculine qualities the woman needs to integrate.
Yeah, what kind of men am I consistently attracted to, and what inner masculine qualities might they be reflecting? So, for example, if you're attracted to emotionally unavailable men, what does that say about your emotional availability?
Yeah, exactly. Instead of blaming the man for being emotionally unavailable.
And sure, some men, some people in general are emotionally unavailable. But if I keep attracting that again and again and again, there's almost some magnetic field that's bringing me towards the emotionally unavailable men and bringing me away from the emotionally available men.
Excellent. Okay, so let's look at some self-inquiry prompts to reveal the anima in men. So this is for you guys, the men of the listeners. Do I tend to idealize women? Right? That's anima projection. Or fear them. That's anima rejection. Or need them to validate me emotionally. Do I lose myself in relationships, trying to merge or to be saved by another woman? When a woman expresses emotion, do I become reactive, withdrawn, or overly responsible? Do I long for a deep soulful connection but sabotage it when it gets too real? And do I listen to my intuition, your inner muse, or override it with logic and control, right? Then you can also reject the anima if you're out of touch with your intuition. And same question as Laura asked, what types of women consistently trigger me, and what might they reflect about my own inner feminine? We see this a lot. We see a lot of hardcore religious dogmatic guys projecting on hippie girls or girls with body counts and all of over and over and over, consistently trigger them. Well, what does that say about their own disconnected animus that they need to be so judgmental about these women? So that takes on a whole new dimension if you bring in depth psychology and understanding of anima and animus.
Okay, so we've just scratched the surface on how the anima and animus shape our lives, affect our relationships. affect the inner narratives that we tell ourselves, and ultimately are in the way sometimes of our spiritual evolution. So in part 2, we're going to go deeper into the healing process, how to recognize when these inner figures are running the show, and what it actually looks like to reclaim them consciously. So in part 2, we're going to talk about the 4 developmental stages of the anima and animus, how to spot the difference between healthy integration and possession, why some women struggle to date because of unconscious animus projections, and why some men idealize, fear, or depend on women due to unintegrated anima relationships. We're going to also offer you some practical tools for healing through creativity, self-inquiry, and inner dialogue, and what it truly means to experience sacred inner union, what Carl Jung called Heros Gamos, where your masculine and feminine work together, not in conflict, but in conscious relationships. So part 2 is about turning these insights into integration. And so if you've ever felt stuck in these relationship patterns, overly critical, or just simply curious about how to step more fully into your power and presence, please don't miss part 2. We hope to see you there. Again, you can sign up for part 2 by going to veilofreality.com/membership, and you'll have access to every second hour. And I'm going to close with a quote from astrologer Liz Green. And she says, individuals blind to the sexual opposite within them, be they men or women, never realize that the partner they choose is chosen because he or she bears some resemblance to the anima or animus. The anger and hurt felt at the true discovery of the partner's failings is really anger and hurt directed at oneself. And this would become apparent were one to see the dark figure within one's own unconscious impelling one into a particular relationship. Like always attracts like, and rather than railing at the partner, one should take a long, close look at one's own psychic makeup. But it is much easier to complain bitterly to analysts, to marriage counselors, to astrologers, and then in our modern times to social media, that yet another relationship has collapsed and yet another partner has proved to be a bad choice. It is also fashionable to blame this on the failures of the parent of the opposite sex. But the past continues to live within the person, not only because in some way it is part of his own substance, but also because he or she permits it to do so. When a disastrous relationship occurs once, we may fool ourselves into believing it is chance. When it occurs twice, it has become a pattern. And a pattern is an unmistakable indication that the anima or animus is at work in the unconscious, propelling the helpless ego into relationships or situations which are baffling, painful, and frighteningly repetitive. Again, it is much wiser to look within oneself for the source of the pattern, rather than the inherent failure of the opposite sex. For these destructive patterns are the psyche's way of making itself known. Although great effort is often required to fulfill its demand for transformation, and great sacrifices also are required of such precious commodities as one's pride, one's self-image, and one's self-righteousness. So we hope you'll join us again for the second hour, and we will see you there.